we can get started. Welcome everybody to lecture number 3. As you can see, it's FDR and the New Deal. So thanks for joining us. And go ahead, Don. You can start.
Good morning, everyone. So this is the third of 4 lectures of America during the Great Depression. So the first lecture, we looked at the causes of the Depression. Last week, we looked at how ordinary people managed to live through the Depression. And so today, we're going to see how the government tried to deal with the problems resulting from the economic catastrophe. Now, you may remember I began last week's lecture by talking about how different the 1930s was from today. The fact that there were no zippers, no ballpoint pens, but in some ways, the 30s are very relevant today. In fact, a few days ago, President Trump even quoted from FDR's "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." But that's a different issue entirely. But I want to begin by pointing out some of the connections between the 1930s and today. So, for example, in the 1930s, as today, there's an extreme gap between the rich and the poor. Also, there was considerable anti-immigrant feeling during the 1930s, as there seems to be in America today. And it was largely because of that anti-immigrant feeling that Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe found it almost impossible to emigrate to the United States. Another similarity is that in the 1930s, there was fears that there might be a socialist revolution against capitalism. And
that's what we have today too.
Today, Trump keeps harping on the allegation that Joe Biden is in the hands of radical socialists, and that if he is elected, that the United States will become socialist. In the 1930s, there was extreme ideological polarization between the left and the right, and that seems to be a similar situation today. And racism and ethnic hatred was a dominant theme in the 1930s, and it still seems to be plaguing the United States today. So these are some of the ways that the 30s have some parallel developments. And finally, personal attacks on the president, as we will see. FDR was the most beloved and also the most hated president of the United States. And today, certainly President Obama was subject to intense personal attacks, and so is President Trump. So let us now begin with our study of the New Deal by focusing on Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When he was a little boy, his father took him to Washington when he had the opportunity to shake hands with then President Grover Cleveland. And Cleveland put his hand on young Franklin's head and said, quote, "I wish for you that you may never be president of the United States." Now, FDR traced the same steps to the White House as did his 5th cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. Like Teddy Roosevelt, FDR was a senator from New York State. He was an assistant secretary of the Navy. He was a vice presidential candidate, and he was governor of New York. the very same offices held by Theodore Roosevelt. FDR contracted polio in August of 1921 at the age of 39, less than a year after losing the 1920 election for vice president. And he faced his paralysis with the same tenacity and self-assuredness as he did with other issues. And that is to say that he simply refused to dwell on it. He didn't want the public to think of him as a cripple. And so he refused to be photographed in his wheelchair. Instead, he had a special chair built to his specifications around a straight back kitchen chair with no arms, so that it didn't look like a wheelchair, as you see here. Though his polio-stricken legs were totally useless, he felt it politically important to appear to be able to stand and walk. So he developed a technique of leaning on someone's arm and balancing on a cane. And thus supported, he would swing one braced leg into place and shift his weight forward so that it looked as if he was actually walking. Now, it's a myth that people didn't know about his polio. People knew, but they didn't know the extent of his illness. He wanted to create the illusion that he had overcome his paralysis, hoping to convey the message that if he could conquer his physical disability, then the country could overcome its economic paralysis in the 1930s. According to biographer Doris Kearns, who wrote No Ordinary Times, she wrote that the paralysis that crippled his body expanded his mind and his sensibilities. He seemed less arrogant, less smug, less superficial, more focused, more complex, more interesting. He returned from his ordeal with greater powers of concentration and greater self-knowledge. Thus, one could say that his character was forged in the fires of this personal physical crisis. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not a great thinker or a great philosopher. In fact, the journalist Walter Lippmann labeled him an amiable Boy Scout. Many looked upon FDR as sort of a democratic version of Warren G. Harding, someone who was not well educated in economics. None of Roosevelt's associates ever saw him reading a book, yet he had boundless intellectual curiosity. At FDR's inauguration in March of 1933, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes described the newly elected president, quote, as a second-class intellect and a first-class temperament. Roosevelt's ultimate strength, ultimate attribute, was his personal charm, his hold on the public. He had an infectious optimism. Edmund Wilson referred to him as a man of slightly unnatural sunniness. FDR had an extraordinary self-confidence, almost bordering on hubris. He presented a sense of calm mastery in almost every situation. His illness brought about a sudden change in his personality. He was no longer a snob, and his paralysis made him a sympathetic person to many people. From almost his first day in office, he established a bond of intimacy with the American people. They felt that they had a friend in the White House. His first fireside chat on March 12, 1933, calmed the nerves of millions of Americans. He spoke in a cultivated manner that was not condescending. He was America's first charismatic president, with the possible exception of his fifth cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. In just his first week in office, he received 450,000 letters. Under Hoover, the White House mailroom had just one employee. Under FDR, there were 70 workers in the mailroom in just the first year of his administration. He wasn't wedded to any particular ideology or philosophy, but he had a sense of responsibility to make life better for everyone. This is called noblesse oblige, that is, the duty of the wealthy to improve the lives of ordinary people. And another attribute of FDR was his flexibility. He was a pragmatist that allowed him to experiment. He was neither doctrinaire nor radical. He believed he was saving capitalism by removing the abuses of the capitalist system. And finally, he was a master politician. He had a sixth sense of grasping public opinion, and he listened to public opinion. During his presidency, he held 998 press conferences. And he knew the deck. That is, he loved political intrigue. But he also had a considerable number of defects. He was not a saint. He was vain, manipulative. He had a passion for secrecy. And he could be petty and devious, vindictive, and duplicitous. In 1918, his wife Eleanor found love letters written from her husband to her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Eleanor threatened Franklin with divorce, and divorce in 1918 would have ended FDR's political career. Today, it's a prerequisite for a political career, but in 1918, it was the end of your career. And so Eleanor said that unless Franklin ended the relationship with Lucy Mercer, she would divorce him. And so he agreed to end the affair. Ironically, the affair liberated Eleanor because part of the agreement was that she insisted that Franklin give her a free hand in her political and social activities. And she later became the most activist first lady in American history. As the First Lady, Eleanor covered 40,000 miles every year, delivering lectures, visiting slums, nursery schools, talking with sharecroppers and miners who were on strike. But when FDR died suddenly in Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945, Lucy Mercer was with him. She discreetly left before Eleanor arrived from Washington. So, although FDR promised to end the affair, he did not fulfill that promise. Another defect was that he was a poor administrator as president. There was much duplication, waste, and inefficiency. He was reluctant to deal with disagreements face to face, and he found it very difficult to fire people who were incompetent. In that way, he was similar to the current chief executive. In FDR's desire to please, he frequently left the impression that he agreed with everyone, and this lack of candor led to confusion and misunderstandings. His mind was open to everything. He listened to everybody and anybody, and he sometimes could be too easily persuaded. His mind was like an unmade bed. It bore the imprint of the last occupant. So wrote historian James McGregor Burns. Herbert Hoover put it a different way. He called FDR a chameleon on plaid, deriding his flexibility. But FDR was neither a god or a devil. He was human, he had failures, and he had successes. So let us look at his political philosophy. You might be surprised to know that he started out as a conservative. He ran on a campaign to balance the budget, to cut government deficits. He believed in capitalism. He had faith in private property and free enterprise and individual initiative. And so his challenge when he was elected president was, how do you resuscitate an economy within the context of a capitalist democratic society? One of his first measures as president was to cut veterans' pensions and to cut government salaries, including those of congressmen. But he was wedded to no particular ideology. He was wedded to innovation and experimentation. A reporter asked him, "Mr. President, are you a communist?" He said, "No." "Are you a capitalist?" He said, "No." "Then what is your philosophy?" Roosevelt answered, "My philosophy? I am a Christian and a Democrat. That's all." Lincoln once said that the dogmas of the quiet past would no longer work. FDR's genius was to recognize that in 1933, such a time had arrived when traditional measures would no longer suffice. Now, FDR was not particularly popular within his own party. He barely won the 1932 Democratic nomination for president. Many delegates considered him a lightweight. Opponents within his own Democratic Party portrayed him as an unprincipled politician. Well, let's look at the relationship between Franklin D. Roosevelt and the sitting president, Herbert Hoover. They were friends during World War I. FDR even wanted to be Hoover's running mate in 1920, but by 1932, they had become political enemies. Hoover wanted Roosevelt to endorse some of his policies in order to restore confidence in the American people. But Roosevelt was a wily politician, and so he refused. Hoover wanted Roosevelt to declare a bank holiday, because that's what Hoover wanted to do. But Roosevelt wanted conditions to deteriorate in 1932 so that when he became president, he could be the savior of the nation. Hoover refused to have his photograph taken with FDR. He explained, "I have too much respect for myself to have my photograph taken with him." FDR criticized Hoover for policies which FDR would later promote. And so he criticized Hoover as, quote, being committed to the idea that we ought to center control of everything in Washington as rapidly as possible. He attacked Hoover for budget deficits and called for sharp reductions in government spending. During the campaign, there was no great debate over issues. Little was said about banking and nothing about foreign policy. The major difference between the two parties in the 1932 election was over prohibition, which the Democrats wanted to end, and tariffs. The Democrats wanted to lower tariff duties. The 1932 campaign was brutal. Rumors circulated that FDR's polio was just a cover for his real illness, which was venereal disease. Hoover warned the electorate not to change horses in midstream in the middle of a depression. Roosevelt responded, "Change horses or drown." FDR won the election with an overwhelming majority. He carried all but the 6 states that you see here in red. He won the Solid South, he ran strong in the West, and he won the vote of urban people and immigrants. But his victory was less an affirmation of his policies than it was a repudiation of Hoover. The relationship between Roosevelt and Hoover was so acrimonious that in the limousine that carried both men to the inauguration, they refused to speak to each other. And this was the cover of the New Yorker magazine on the day of the inauguration. And if you look at Hoover's face, you can see he was not a happy camper. Supposedly, when he became president, Roosevelt renamed the Hoover Dam and called it the Boulder Dam. And when he was asked why he did that, he said because in his estimation, Hoover wasn't worth the dam. Now, that's an apocryphal story. I'm sure he didn't say that, but it always gets a laugh. Roosevelt won the election in November. He did not take office until the following March. But during the interregnum, on February 15th, 1933, he was in a motorcade in Miami when Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak stepped up to the side of Roosevelt's car, and then shots rang out. An assassin's bullet intended for the president-elect killed the Chicago mayor. The bullet missed Roosevelt by inches, and Mayor Cermak died in Roosevelt's arms. No one was sure what Roosevelt would do once he took office in March of 1933. Despite the 4 months between the election and the inauguration, Roosevelt did not work out any specific plans for economic recovery. But if he did have any plan in 1933, it was almost identical to the measures that Hoover had already adopted: aid for farmers, promoting industrial cooperation, support for banks, and balancing the budget. On March 4th, he gave his inaugural address, in which he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But he was mistaken. There was plenty to fear in March of 1933. On the very day he took office, the entire banking system in the United States ground to a halt when the governors of New York and Illinois closed their banks. March 4th was the inauguration. On March 5th, Roosevelt called for a 4-day national bank holiday, which Hoover had actually urged him to endorse. He called for the bank holiday. He called it a bank holiday, but he wanted to close the nation's banks to prevent people from withdrawing their money. Because when everybody withdraws their money from the banks, banks collapse and they can no longer loan money to business. And a day later, he signed the Emergency Banking Act, which allowed inspectors to evaluate those troubled banks and to decide whether those banks should be allowed to reopen. FDR told Americans it was safer to put their money in a bank than under a mattress. And most people believed him. The next day, money began flowing back into the banks. It's important to remember what a tremendous gamble this was. He had no plan B. If Americans had continued to take money out of the banks, the economy would have totally collapsed. But FDR opposed federal guarantees of bank deposits. He thought that would only benefit the irresponsible bankers. But he accepted it when it was clear that Congress would pass a law creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. On March 10th, Roosevelt requested Congress slash $500 million from the federal budget, that Congress reduce the salaries of government workers, including congressmen, and impose a 50% reduction in the payments to veterans. These are all things that Hoover wanted. On March 13th, Roosevelt gave his first fireside chat. He was convinced that the newspapers were in the hands of political conservatives, and he was right. And so he decided to make use of the new electronic medium of radio in order to speak directly to the American people. On March 20th, Congress repealed prohibition. So all of these things happened in 2 breathless weeks. FDR sent 15 messages to Congress, which in turn signed 15 bills into law. This was known as the 100 Days. And there was no grand design to these laws that Roosevelt asked Congress to pass. It was all improvised. And it created many agencies that were known by their letters. They were known as alphabet agencies, like the WPA, the PWA, the AAA, as you see here in this cartoon. And so the Glass-Steagall Banking Act created the FDIC to prevent the run on banks. And of course, the FDIC is an important part of the banking industry today. Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act to restore the purchasing power of farmers. Remember, the price of farm crops were falling, and farmers' income was declining. They couldn't pay their mortgages. The purchasing powers of farmers had plunged 60% since 1929. By early 1933, banks were foreclosing on farm mortgages at the rate of $20,000 a month. And so what the Agricultural Adjustment Act did was it paid farmers not to produce in order to cut the supply of agricultural products. Once the supply was cut, then the price of farm crops increased, and that benefited farmers. Now, this Agricultural Adjustment Act would ultimately be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as an unnecessary invasion of private property rights. During the 100 days, Congress passed the Farm Credit Act that gave low-interest government loans to farmers in order to prevent foreclosure of mortgages. Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard in order to let the exchange value of the dollar to drift downward, and then created the National Industrial Recovery Act to get business to end cutthroat competition. It established the National Recovery Administration that intended to stimulate industrial production and have industries set up a series of codes to regulate prices and to increase industrial output. The NLRA also brought businesses to agree on minimum wages and minimum prices. And Section 7A guaranteed workers the right to unionize and to bargain collectively. But ultimately, the National Industrial Recovery Act failed for 3 reasons. It assumed business would be willing to police itself. The codes were established in the interest of protecting workers and consumers. But in the end, these codes were drawn up by the largest companies, and that hurt small business. And corporations rarely respected the rights of labor to unionize. And because of the complexity of the codes, the federal government never really enforced labor's right to collective bargaining. And so within 2 years, the Supreme Court declared the NLRA unconstitutional. Another agency that was created in the 100 days was the Public Works Administration, which allocated federal funds to construct roads, bridges, public buildings, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built government-owned power projects to supply electricity to people in depressed areas in Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. Now, right-wingers condemned the Tennessee Valley Authority as socialistic because it was a government-owned industry. But it was a brilliant political strategy because it won Roosevelt's support from Southern Democrats as well as from Republican progressives. The 100 Days also set up the Civil Conservation Corps, a public works project operated under the control of the Army. It was designed to promote environmental conservation while getting young unemployed men off the city streets. The CCC housed young men in tents and barracks. It gave them 3 square meals a day and paid them a small stipend. It put 3 million idle youngsters at work. They were paid $30 a month, $25 of which they were required to send home to their families. After all, the CCC was providing them with housing and food. So the reason these young men didn't need more than $5 a month. The Civil Conservation Corps planted 3 billion trees. Unfortunately, many of them that are burning as we speak. They built hiking trails and ski runs that we enjoy today, all the result of the CCC. During the 100 days, the Federal Emergency Relief Act was passed, which provided $500 million in aid to state and local government. And this direct federal unemployment relief charted the path towards the modern American welfare system. The Homeowners Loan Corporation enabled banks to unload mortgages to the federal government and thus avoid foreclosures. And so home ownership went from 40% of the population to 70% because of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And Congress created the Securities and Exchange Commission to police the stock market. Before the 1930s, the securities trading environment was steeped in mystery and ignorance. For example, there had been no requirement for firms to even issue balance sheets. But the Securities and Exchange Commission forced businesses to make public facts about their profits and losses. And so the SEC was a core durable effect of the New Deal. It went to the heart of the financial industry. So to evaluate the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency, it succeeded in halting the bank panic. It authorized the biggest public works program in American history. The Tennessee Valley Authority was an unprecedented experiment in comprehensive planned regional development. On this map, you can see in the darker shade of green the areas that were served by the TVA. The people in these areas were so poor that private power companies did not want to build electrical plants because they felt that it would not be profitable. And so the government stepped in with the Tennessee Valley Project. And they built dams that you see in red here in order to produce the electricity that was now available to poor people in the Tennessee Valley. The first 100 days also provided assistance to the unemployed, but the direction of Roosevelt's program was still uncertain. Some of the measures he took were conservative, like cutting the budget by 30%, which was the largest reduction in American history, by refusing to nationalize the banks. But other measures were progressive, expansive spending for relief and for public works. And so those programs appeared radical. But for all the achievements of the 100 days, the Depression still hung darkly over the nation. Throughout the 1930s, the unemployment rate never fell below 14%. And for the decade of the 1930s, unemployment averaged 17%. So if we look at this chart of unemployment from 1930 to 1945, during the 1930s, as you can see, unemployment never fell below 15%. Now, some of the programs created by Roosevelt's New Deal were not as effective as they could have been. So, for example, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration sent checks that flowed disproportionately to certain swing states outside of the South, but not to the South, because the South voted solidly Democratic. And so Roosevelt didn't have to worry about the South. So instead, these federal emergency relief checks went to swing states in order to convince them to vote Democratic. Another failure of some of these programs was that those who received relief payments were often humiliated by welfare administrators who call them bums and freeloaders. Recipients of welfare payments were subjected to a means test, which was a detailed examination of their private lives. Social workers would lecture them on budgeting and on health and diets. And because of this, many men who had been fired from their jobs refused to accept this kind of inspection and harassment from social workers. Nevertheless, many features of the 100 days have become part of American life today. And for many historians, the 100 days has become the defining moment of the 20th century. It created a new sense of social obligation, or as one historian put it, something magical happened in the 1930s when ordinary people felt that the government was on their side, protecting the powerless. And so I think the psychological impact of the New Deal legislation was just as important as the economic impact. People felt for the first time in a long time that the government was on their side. Now, there were many who were very much opposed to Roosevelt's program. Conservatives called him a socialist, a traitor to his class. And so this editorial appeared in the New York Journal American. It was in the form of a poem. A red deal with a Soviet seal, endorsed by a Moscow hand, the strange result of an alien cult in a liberty-loving land. The truth is out, and there is no doubt of the trends of the New Deal heads. Their plans are made and their courses laid with the blessings of the Reds. But with the exception of the Tennessee Valley Authority, nothing that FDR did was socialistic. He could have easily nationalized the banks and the railroads, but he didn't. Roosevelt wanted to stabilize capitalism, not to eliminate it. Nevertheless, anti-FDR hate-mongering was fashionable, particularly among the upper class in the 1930s. And so this is a very famous New Yorker cartoon. It shows wealthy people on New York's Fifth Avenue, and the caption reads, "Come along, we're going to the movies to hiss Roosevelt. And rumors were spread among the wealthy about FDR. They said they refused to even refer to him by his name. They called him that man in the White House. And one rumor was that he had caught gonorrhea from Eleanor. Another rumor was that he was dying of venereal disease and that Eleanor Roosevelt was actually running the country, and that after her husband died, she would turn the country over to the Russians. And she would then go to live in Moscow to learn unspeakable sexual practices taught only in the Kremlin. Harold Gray, the creator of the comic strip Little Orphan Annie, was one of FDR's severest critics. Daddy Warbucks, the character that you see here, was very wealthy. And in one of the episodes of Little Orphan Annie, Harold Gray has Daddy Warbucks unable to stand the thought of living in America under another term of a Roosevelt presidency, and so he commits suicide. He throws himself to his death. But after FDR died in 1945, Harold Gray brought Daddy Warbucks back to life, claiming, quote, "Since the climate is different and it is now possible for a man of property and decency to breathe freely again." Roosevelt also had critics on the left. Disillusionment with FDR ran deepest and most dangerously on the political left, especially among jobless workers and impoverished farmers. The American Communist Party polled over 100,000 votes in 1932, but it remained a small and relatively isolated group throughout the 1930s. 1/3 of all members of the Communist Party were New Yorkers. Socialists hated Roosevelt for saving capitalism at a time when it seemed that capitalism was about to collapse. Norman Thomas was the socialist candidate for president from 1928 to 1948. He was asked whether Roosevelt's New Deal carried out the goals of socialism, and he answered sardonically, yes, on a stretcher, meaning that Roosevelt's New Deal adopted some elements of the socialist program, and in doing so, pretty much destroyed the Socialist Party. Reverend Charles E. Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest, represented a more serious threat to Roosevelt's New Deal. He became enormously popular as a result of his radio sermons, a Sunday night broadcast listened to by millions of Americans. In fact, it was the most popular radio program of the 1930s. It was called The Golden Hour of the Little Flower, and it was broadcast from Detroit. It reached an audience of some 40 million listeners. His rhetoric was a curious combination of anti-communism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Semitism. At first, he supported the New Deal. He called it Christ's deal. But then he became increasingly upset at the slow pace of reform, as well as his inability to play a major policy-making role in the Roosevelt administration. Additionally, he viewed as criminally wasteful some of the tactics used by the Agricultural Adjustment Act to limit farm production. He launched the National Union for Social Justice in order to challenge the president. He claimed that Roosevelt had out-Hoovered Hoover. He charged that FDR was in league with Wall Street and international Jewish financiers. He wanted government to nationalize the banks and key industries. By 1934, Father Coughlin was receiving more mail than anyone in America, including the president. He once suggested that FDR's leadership be terminated by a bullet. And as his bitterness and virulence increased, his influence began to diminish. Another demagogue was Dr. Francis Townsend, a 66-year-old physician from Long Beach, California. He had been laid off from his job as an assistant city health officer, and so he conceived of a plan to save America. His prescription for national recovery was to give everyone over the age of 60 a monthly pension of $200 a month if they agreed to spend every penny of that $200. And this would be funded by a 2-cent tax on every business transaction. His plan made no economic sense, but it was seductive. To make the recommended payments to 9% of the population of over 60 would have soaked up half of the national income. A much more dangerous demagogue was Huey Long, senator from Louisiana. He was the most powerful critic of the New Deal. He was governor of Louisiana and then later a US senator from that state. He was known as the Kingfish, and he was the most powerful governor in Louisiana's history. While he was still governor, he got himself elected to the Senate, and he became the virtual dictator of the state of Louisiana. He used his power to expand Louisiana's undeveloped infrastructure, and he helped to build new hospitals, schools, highways, and the state's university. Those are very good programs. His campaign slogan was, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." He came up with the idea of redistributing wealth, which was very popular among the lower classes of Louisiana. At first, he supported FDR, but he soon found the New Deal to be too conservative. And so he broke with Roosevelt. He was convinced that FDR was in bed with big business. And so he established what he called the Share Our Wealth Society, an organization that advocated taxing the rich to help the poor. He promised a steeply progressive income tax on incomes over $1 million and on inheritances over $5 million in order to provide money for $5,000 homestead credit allowance to all American families, to provide a radio, an automobile, and a washing machine for every American, $2,000 guaranteed income for all Americans, and free college education. Also, he called for shorter working days and government storage of crops to help out farmers and the poor. He added promises of improved veteran benefits and educational subsidies for the young, pensions for the elderly. His brand of politics was a type of neo-populism, which found followers not only in Louisiana, but among low-income rural families across the country. He was considered a serious threat to FDR when he announced his intention to run for president in 1938. But those presidential aspirations came to an abrupt and tragic end when in September of 1935, he was assassinated by the son of a ruined political opponent. He was shot on the steps of the Louisiana State Capitol. Now, Roosevelt's first New Deal was followed by what historians characterized as the Second New Deal from 1935 to 1937. The Second New Deal came about in part because of the mounting criticism against the policies of the First New Deal. Beginning in 1935, Roosevelt began to send to Congress a host of new legislative initiatives, which some historians characterize as Roosevelt's shift to the left. The keystone of his Second New Deal was the Social Security Act, a more rational response to the harebrained solutions offered by Huey Long and Father Coughlin and Francis Townsend. The Social Security Act was the most consequential and most long-lasting of all the New Deal legislation. It provided for unemployment insurance and old age pensions as well. It offered a measure of security to 26 million workers. On the one hand, Social Security seemed a fairly radical piece of reform legislation, since the government was committing itself to providing help for the elderly. But in reality, it really was a fairly conservative program, since workers and their employers, not the government, was footing the bill. In addition, the initial Social Security Act did not include provisions for farm workers or domestic workers or employees of restaurants and service industries or health providers. Still, the act was a milestone in American history because it acknowledged the responsibility of society at large to take care of the less fortunate. And it's interesting today that those who bellow against socialism, when asked, are you willing to give up your Social Security payments? They say, oh, no, no, don't touch my Social Security or my Medicare. Well, those are elements of socialism. A second pillar of the second New Deal was the Works Progress Administration, which ran from 1935 through 1943. This was a program that spent $12 billion to give jobs to 9 million people. 3/4 of the money went for construction projects. The idea of creating jobs drew an onslaught of criticism from the political right. And much of the attacks against these government-sponsored work programs was expressed in the form of jokes. And so a farmer asked a druggist for some of that WPA poison. I hear it won't kill squirrels, but it will make them so lazy that I can stomp them to death. Another joke was that a WPA worker sued the government for damages suffered when the shovel on which he was leaning broke. So the criticism was that when the government creates jobs, there's no incentive for workers to work hard. But that wasn't borne out in reality. Actually, the WPA was one of the most important and successful of all New Deal programs. At its peak, the WPA employed 40% of the nation's jobless. Many WPA jobs were in unskilled construction work, particularly on roads. Construction projects range from housing projects to high schools to building football stadiums. WPA jobs were the first indication for many Americans that the federal government was taking responsibility for their welfare and would be taking responsibility to look after the less fortunates in society. The WPA brought America's infrastructure into the 20th century, adding 650,000 miles of roads, 78,000 bridges to the country's transportation network. It improved the nation's health with water and sewer treatment systems and new hospitals, and 125,000 civilian and military buildings. It advanced the age of civil aviation with some 800 new and improved airports. Its work on military bases and the workers it trained helped the services to meet the demands of World War II. The WPA also provided jobs for artists, middle-class professionals, teachers, and students. It brought arts to the millions who had never been exposed to them before. People today still play golf on WPA-built golf courses. They swim in WPA-built swimming pools and ski at WPA winter sports complexes. The Works Progress Administration took a broad view of, quote, workers, with special programs devised for writers and musicians and actors and artists. Under the WPA umbrella, the Federal Arts Project employed more than 5,000 artists who created 225,000 works of art for the American people during the 1930s. And these can still be seen in public buildings and museums across the country. Some of these artists worked in their studios and submitted artworks to the government for libraries and schools. Others worked at community art centers or taught art to wider audiences. Jackson Pollock, among others, got his start in the WPA. Some 200 murals were created in California with WPA funding, including this mural, which still stands in Long Beach Poly High School, showing the progress of transportation in the 1930s, as well as this mural at Long Beach Poly High School. Included under the umbrella of the WPA was the Federal Writers Project, which commissioned noted American writers to write regional guidebooks and histories of the American people. And as part of the Federal Writers Project, those former slaves who were still alive were interviewed, and they remain a valuable archive in understanding the slave experience. And the Federal Theater Project was established to bring music and drama to even the smallest communities in the United States. The efforts of the WPA marked the first time that the federal government tried to support and promote American art and American culture. Another part of the second New Deal was the WAGNER Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act. And this act guaranteed workers the right to unionize and the right to bargain collectively with management. Remember, the NLRA tried to do that, but it largely failed. But the WAGNER Act successfully won workers the right to unionize. And so for the first time, the federal government recognized and protected labor unions. The second New Deal also featured a wealth tax. Increased taxes on the wealthy created newer and larger taxes on excess business profits, on inheritances, on profits from the sale of property. This tax raised the hackles of business leaders and the wealthy elite. The president, who himself was a child of affluence, was then branded a communist and a traitor to his class. But taxing the wealthy provided funds for those at the bottom of the social pyramid. Okay, I see we're about at the end of our time. And so next week, we will begin with continuing the New Deal, and then we will move into the topic of foreign policy in the 1930s. And so we are going to now take a look at the questions